Good afternoon and konnichiwa from Toronto, Canada. My name is Yuko Shimizu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation, Toronto. Thank you everyone for tuning in from across Canada and around the world. Today's event, KATSUSHIKA Oei, a woman artist in the floating world, was made possible with the support of our friend, the Japan Society. I would especially like to thank the Japan Society Canada's Executive Director, Ms. Asami Okusawa, who arranged this timely talk. Earlier this year, our center hosted the Manga Hokusai manga exhibition, and just this summer, the British Museum announced the rediscovery of more than 100 Hokusai prints. Of course, we're here today not to talk about Hokusai, but his daughter, Oei, who stood in her father's shadows for far too long. Ultimately, Oei's talents could not be eclipsed. In recent years, movies like Miss Hokusai and novels such as Miss Govier's The Ghost Brush have brought Oei's story to a wider audience. Today, we will hear in-depth presentations and discussions about her experiences as an artist in Edo, Japan, her amazing techniques, her contributions to Hokusai's work, and why she deserves to be studied and celebrated. Our first speaker today is Ms. Katherine Govier, a longtime friend and supporter of the Japan Foundation, Toronto. A multiple award-winning novelist, Ms. Govier's novel about Oei, titled The Ghost Brush, has been published worldwide and is perhaps many English-speaking audiences' first introductions to Oei. Ms. Govier has always been committed to raising the voices of marginalized women. Recently, she founded the SHOE Project, a writing and public speaking workshop for immigrant and refugee women. She has also served as president of PEN Canada and chair of the Writers' Trust. We also welcome Dr. Rosina Buckland, curator of the Japanese collections at the British Museum. Dr. Buckland has a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and she has worked at the National Museum of Scotland and most recently at the Royal Ontario Museum right here in Toronto. Her primary research area is pictorial art of the 19th century. Today, we will depend on her expertise to shed some light on ukiyo-e in Edo, Japan. Today's talk will be expertly moderated by Ms. Deanna Horton, Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Ms. Horton has contributed 12 years of foreign service in Japan, including as Deputy Head of Mission at the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo. Ms. Horton is a Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and a Canadian Global Affairs Institute Fellow. She is also a supporter of the arts and has served on the Board of Trustees at the Royal Ontario Museum. And now I will turn the camera over. Please join me in enjoying this special presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shimizu-san, and welcome to everyone. It is really an honor for me to moderate this panel today on such an interesting topic, KATSUSHIKA Oei. I would like to thank Asami-san from the Japan Society for having such a great idea, and of course to the Japan Foundation. So I'm first going to ask Katherine Govier to speak and then Rosina Buckland, and please remember to send your questions. So I'm going to start with this book, The Ghost Brush, or known as The Printmaker's Daughter in the US. This is a quote, and this is, which I think really tells the whole story. This is from one of Oei-san's lovers in the book, Samba Shikite, and he says, "The gods have made you a great painter, and they have made you a woman too. They have made you better than your father. It is a cruel joke." On that note, I would like to turn over to Katherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here today with you all and with an audience to talk about Katsushika Oei. As you all know, she was a painter, she was a designer of prints, she was the manager of the North Star Studio, which was her father's workshop, and she was a dutiful daughter and caregiver. She was born in the year 1800, we believe, and died unknown in an unknown place and is buried, we don't know where, in either 1866 or 1868. She grew up working in the studio and learning from her father. She left home to marry, but divorced and came home when her mother died, and was the only family member to remain with the old man, as they called Hokusai, until his death at 90. And this may be the very first time that Katsushika Oei has been the focus of such distinguished attention. And I thank you, Dr. Buckland and Ms. Horton, for joining us to talk about what I know and what I have speculated and what I believe about Oei. The youngest daughter of Hokusai, who she was, has always lit up the imagination. It was Richard Lane, a very early student and collector and writer about ukiyo-e, who said, "Definitive paintings by Oei are rare, but they do exist." He said she deserves a study of her own. He wasn't about to take it up, but he said it is better suited to the realm of novelists. So here comes your novelist. Oei inspires. She inspired me when I first heard about the difficulties in attribution in the last 10 years of Hokusai's life and the possibilities of forgeries, the fact that she was always close to his side. She has inspired manga artists. She has inspired the filmmaker whose poster you can see behind me, Miss Hokusai. She has inspired Ryuta Kimura, the documentary filmmaker in Japan, whose recent work was shown on television there. And she inspires many young artists in Japan. As a matter of fact, I'm told that they use her recipes, which she has left, to make colors. What I'm going to show you is some images right now from another Japanese woman artist who is very inspired by Oei. And her name is Kaori Mirai. You're looking at the work of Kaori Mirai, who is a Tokyo artist who is very inspired by Oei's work. And together she and I have plotted out a graphic book of Oei's work. Kaori has been very well known for her digital work. She is also the graphic artist who does the posters and promotional work for the Hokusai Museum in Sumida. On your left, that is on the left of this image, is Oei's hand dancing, showing her characteristic long, thin fingers. In the center is one of these very mysterious tigers who have appeared in the last few years of Hokusai's life. And on the right are some dragons. So who was Oei, aside from the daughter of Hokusai? She was eccentric, she was brilliant, she was devoted to her father. She was, I think, the victim of a certain amount of scorn. She gathered a rather terrible reputation. Now, what we know about her life is only snippets we get in descriptions of Hokusai. So she is never truly the focus of the lens, but she is kind of sitting off in the background, and she's someone who's just there. Sometimes he's even described as solitary while she's sitting right beside him. She is described as homely. She had a long chin, which gave her another nickname, which was Ago Ago, Chin Chin. She was, and I quote, of a rather masculine, domineering nature. She resembles her father. Instead of washing the dishes after a meal, she just leaves them lying around without thinking twice about it. Apparently they lived on takeout, which you could do in the Edo period, and the crime of not sewing also attached to her name. But what puzzled me is her images. They're far from gloomy. She's described as depressive, gloomy. Apparently she drinks. But look at the vibrant and the exquisite, the tenderness of her work. This is on the right, you see Kaori's blow up of the detail of this painting, which lives in the Maynard Museum in Japan. And on the left, you see the longer shot of a courtesan under the cherry blossoms. She seems to be writing a poem. And there it is more closely. And here's another of Oei's image. Is probably her most famous. This is called Three Women Musicians, and you've seen it on the invitation, as a matter of fact. It is owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was collected in the 1880s by William Sturgis Bigelow, which is interesting because it was only certainly less than 20 years since she died anonymously. But you can see that for me, for a novelist or a creative person, there is a great mystery here. In fact, during Oei's long life devoted to art, there came a time when she was called one of the most famous artists in Edo. And this was very late in her father's life, 1847, when she did some illustrated books. On the top line, again, this is set up by Kaori. On the top line is a book about collecting tea, which she illustrated, and the bottom line is this illustrated manual for women. This is owned in the Ishikawa Art Museum, a copy of it. It was actually printed in brilliant color. It's ironic that her greatest fame, it seems, in life came from this manual, which is a kind of Bible of Confucian behavior codes for women, how to set a table, how to sit at in a lower station than the men in the family, how to shop for fabrics and so on. You can see the woman on the right here is actually using that famous third finger to put some makeup on. Well, we know that Oei didn't wear makeup. She didn't set a fine table. They barely owned a teapot. She was not a typical woman. We don't think she ever had children. There are lots of pictures of children in this. So interesting, she was set in that mode. She was hired to illustrate this manual. But there was a lot else that she was in charge of and doing. When she first moved back in with her father, it was during the 1820s, and he was ill. He had a stroke. He was quite disabled. He couldn't speak. He needed help walking. And she apparently ran the studio and did a lot of work under the name of, under his name. Then in 1830, he recovered. He was 70, and this began this magical period when he produced 36 views of Mount Fuji. I thought you'd seen the Great Wave enough, so I thought I'd use an image here of Red Fuji. And this is the period during which many series of prints emerged from the studio. A great deal of work was going on. He was famously well and productive and traveling and so on. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Rosina Buckland about what else seems to have been created in that period. Despite the beauty of her presentations of women, there was a dark side to Oei and a dark side to life for women. Most of the ukiyo-e artists, as you know, spent a great deal of time in the brothel district. Their images, their most famous images are of beauties who were courtesans, and courtesan in this case, I'm afraid to tell you, is a very polite way of saying prostitute. They were mostly impoverished rural girls who were sold by their families into what amounted to sexual slavery. So none of those male painters had ever done an image quite like this. This is always nighttime in the Yoshiwara. The women behind the lattice are basically waiting for customers, and they're shown in this bright, gaudy light, and the customers or the onlookers are all in dark, kind of leaning in. Maybe someone's having a little conversation here. There seems to be a secret signature on some of these lanterns, which is identifies this as by Oei, but it's a very different perspective, shall we say. And this is also known to be by Oei. This is Guanyin's arm. It was sold out of Japan. It lives in Cleveland at the Art Museum then. And it's an example of a painting. It's known as a Meiji masterpiece. This is Guanyin, the Chinese general, who is so brave that although he is injured and although he has to be bled, and in fact his bones have to be scraped with this knife, he is focused enough so that he can continue with his game of Go. So these faces, this again, the fingers, the colors, very typical and very identifiable, I think, as Oei. So there are in the world, I think 10 now images which are identified as hers. We know, as Richard Lane said, she spent her lifetime making art. She lived past her father's death. For 5 years, we know where she was. She worked as one brush, which is what she wanted. The country entered into a chaotic period where the black ships arrived, and then there was civil war and so on. And somehow, I like this image because it seems to me about the great swirling, and she's gone down the drain. What happened? This is my question. How could this happen? I was fascinated when I began this, what was it, 14 years ago now, by the life of this charismatic woman who has fascinated so many. But I later began to look at this essential puzzle. How does it work that someone who is the best known artist in Edo at 1 year just disappears? We don't know what happened to her work. We don't even know where she died. And that seems to me to be a very interesting question that Oei's life raises. It's not just where is her fabulous work and why don't we know more of it? And, you know, how did she fall under the wave of her father's great fame? But it's the process, this process of disappearing, which I think relates to many more women artists than just Oei, many more women than just Oei. And it happens step by step and it doesn't happen all at once. I think in Oei's case, there was what I call the perfect storm. She was acted upon by two different histories. Neither of them was favorable toward women, not the Japanese art side, nor the collectors, nor the white men who came. So these, I'm going to just show you, that's really my talk. I'm going to show you a few pictures of works that are suspected or are likely to be by Oei. This little courtesan on the right is in Leyden. It was collected in about 1827 by Dr. Philip von Sebald. It seems this young woman is absolutely overburdened with her opulent clothes. They look like bruises and eyes staring at her. She's got her neck bent over. She's very sympathetically portrayed. This is a young woman with very unsteady steps. Chrysanthemums is another famous picture, which is highly disputed. It's in the Hokusai Museum in Obusei in the mountains of Nagano. It was actually commissioned by the museum there 4 years after Hokusai's death. It is widely recognized as the detailed work of Oei, and yet it hangs with Hokusai's name, possibly assisted by his daughter Oei. And here is the second last image I'd like to show, which is called a self-portrait. It is in the Guimet Museum in France, and it is Hokusai's self-portrait, even though 100 years earlier, more than 100 years, in 1900, Fenlosa, who was one of the major collectors in Japan, said that tradition held that it was by the daughter. And lastly, I'll show you gamecocks at the Metropolitan Museum. And I want to show you this because it's an example of what's happening with gamecocks. It's an example of what we can do when we look at these images, which seem to have no history, possibly not the right signature or no signature at all. And Dr. John Carpenter, who I have to say has been my mentor, perhaps not willingly, since the very beginning, has said, yes, there is no way of knowing, this is known as Hokusai, there is no way of knowing for sure who painted it, but it does seem to be someone who had access to the master's seals and who was an ultra meticulous painter, which we know Oei was. To me, this does not seem like a later Meiji production, but it is by someone close to Hokusai in his later years. So I'm finished with that. I can't wait to hear what other people have to say. I'm, again, taking my start from my new novel, which is actually finished. I finally delivered it. And that this question, why has Oei been unacknowledged as an artist, yet has been so charismatic as a character? What does it have to do with Japan and the perspective of Japanese people on their history? Somehow Oei is the unacknowledged, the scorned even, the secret, the mystery of Hokusai. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. There's so much food for thought in there, but I think it will be very useful to hear from Dr. Buckland about, and just to give us a little bit of context for KATSUSHIKA Oei. So I'll turn it over to you, Rosina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. That was fascinating to hear from Catherine about the reality of Oei, and I've tremendously enjoyed reading the novel and having something of her come alive through your dramatization of her life. I'm going to share my screen now, all being well. Does that come through, Deanna? Wonderful. So I'll give some context to the reality of this father-daughter team, the context of prints and paintings during this period, and perhaps expand that body of possible Oei works that Katherine has introduced us to. In Hokusai's and Oei's lifetime, Edo was the world's most populous city, with over 1 million inhabitants. The permanent residents were supplemented by shifting hordes of feudal retainers accompanying their masters, who were obliged to reside in the shogun's city for set periods of time each year. This population generated tremendous demand for diversion and entertainment. Rates of literacy were high, and the publishing industry was very well developed, with plenty of rival outfits vying for customers' attention and coinage. You see here a view of an illustrated bookshop in Izoshiya in the Shiba district in the south of the city of Edo. From 1797, an illustrated gazetteer, a topographical guide from 1897. And there are books and single sheet prints ranged on the shelves for buyers to browse. Traditional Japanese books. Let's see if I can. There we go. Traditional Japanese books were materially different from the volumes we know. They were always soft bound, using strong and supple paper made from mulberry fibers. Printing was done by wood block, and one of the advantages of this technique was the ability to combine text and image freely on one page. Hokusai himself depicted a book and print shop in his work Amusements of the Eastern Capital, published in 1802. And we see various titles advertised on boards outside at the top right, and piles of prints for people to select from. There's a detail of the eager customers leaning in to see what they can pick up. And then a gorgeous representation in saturated colors from a few years after Hokusai's death in 1857 shows women of various ages gathering to check out the latest releases and perhaps having a gossip while they're there. And at the far left is an advertisement for the series of Views of Edo by Hiroshige, Utagawa Hiroshige, who had been Hokusai's great rival while Hokusai was alive, and obviously carried on for a few years after him. And printed matter, be it books, prints, games, or charms, were popular, accessible, and affordable. A single sheet was said to cost about the same as a double helping of noodles. So if you could forego your supersized meal, you could afford a print. And of course, the publisher wanted you to spend more. So a design like this one, comprising 3 sheets, cost you 3 times as much. Now, we focus on the artists very often, but it was the publishers who ran this show. This diagram shows the complex journey of a print from drawing board to shop shelf. You don't need to understand the Japanese here, you can ignore that. The main message is a process of collaboration and back and forth among publisher, artists, censor, who was often another publisher, block cutter, and printer. So I just want you to get the idea of these arrows going back and forth among all of these different operatives within this process. And in creating the physical prints, there were 2 main stages after the design had been created, that is. The 2 main stages: cutting the block, which involved pasting the final design face down on a block of cherry wood and cutting through it. So you see that at top left and center. And here we see Hokusai's iconic design under the wave off Kanagawa. So I've gone for the obvious one that's being recreated here by contemporary craftspeople. And then the blocks, when they were finished, they were passed to the printer. This is just the first stage we see here being produced, the key block, and then subsequent colors will be added from other blocks. The more colors there are in a design, the more blocks you need. And this production line system allowed for several hundred impressions to be struck off quickly, and blocks were often retained and reused later on. So this is how prints are large in number, popular, cheap. And in terms of how prints were used, they were often just like posters today, pasted up on the wall as decoration or as tokens of someone's fandom, their dedication to the actor or courtesan that they followed. And this fellow on the right obviously has quite eclectic tastes. We have some sumo wrestlers, we have an actor, and we have courtesans. And maybe even a landscape up the top here, and fish. Some bird, fish, flower studies, etc. There were many genres of prints, and Hokusai was active in most of them. His earliest training was in the studio of an artist specializing in kabuki actor imagery, and this is the subject matter of Hokusai's earliest prints, when he was using the name Shunro. So on the left, we have the actor Ichikawa Ebizo from 1791, and then a wonderful view on the right, showing Hokusai's interest in Western forms of representation already at this early stage. The vanishing point perspective that's really used to full advantage in this interior view of kabuki theatre in Edo, one of the glories of Edo, the splendor and fantastic extravagance and opulence of the visual spectacle of the kabuki theatre and the crowds, or the people crowded in to watch. Oops, excuse me. But from around the time of the death of the great artist Kitagawa Utamaru in 1806, so after that point till about 1819, by far Hokusai's greatest output was in book illustration. And his work in this field continued afterwards for the rest of his life. So I really want to emphasize how important books are in this world, and books are in Hokusai and also Oei's production, from what we can surmise. Hokusai was responsible for creating 3 completely new genres of the single sheet prints, as well as this book production. We all know he was very prolific. Firstly, his work in the genre of warriors, or in the subject of warriors within the field of book illustration, prompted other artists to take up this theme, this subject matter in single sheet prints. So we can give Hokusai credit for that area, the warriors. And this is a very famous Chinese tale that was adapted in Japan, The Tales of the Water Margin, and Hokusai's illustrated version of this from 1829. Next up, oops. In a period of a strict control of imagery by these censors, landscape provided a relatively uncontroversial area. And it also responded to growing enthusiasm for travel amongst the populace in Japan at this time, both real travel, often under the guise of pilgrimage, and also armchair travel. And similarly, on the right, the natural world was free of political strife, and Hokusai produced beautiful images of the birds and flowers that his customers, his fans, the ordinary people could see around them. And he also capitalized on contemporary interest in botanical and natural history studies. So this is the context in which Oei grew up and trained. As Katherine has begun to introduce, we have this small corpus of paintings known to be by Oei, such as the 3 musicians on the left, and on the right, woman fulling cloth. And in contrast to the prints, these are unique works from the hand of the artist herself, either on silk or on paper. Both of these works fall into the genre of pictures of beauties, which Hokusai created in painting, though not so much in print, and Oei herself continued. The work on the right employs the conventions of East Asian painting with very calligraphic ink contours to create, strokes, to create the contours of the robes. But in the work on the left, we begin to see Oei's particular interest in representing light and shade, in the very careful modeling of the folds of fabric. So describing the 3-dimensionality of these fabrics, of these voluminous fabrics very often, through shading. And of course, her night scene in Yoshiwara that we just saw. This is a painting that takes this exploration of light and shadow to its highest point, using the strong contrasts to convey a sense of suspense, mystery, and even melancholy, as Katherine was explaining, the sadness of the women who had to work in this world, the sex workers who were indentured to the brothels. It's a mix of the fantasy and the glamour, but also that melancholy, or a combination of those two elements. And then there are the works where we strongly suspect Oei assisted her father, such as the Dutch paintings created on imported Dutch paper and sent back to Europe with the physician Philip Franz von Siebold via Nagasaki. We see again in these works that gentle rendering of fabric with detailed volumetric shading and also an interest in shadows. And I draw your attention to the curtain on the left here, where we can see very sharp creases created, or the illusion of creases created by depicting light and shade. And also perhaps we see an affection for cats with this happily snoozing little fellow curled up on the rug. The Dutch paintings are a wonderful record of the customs of Japan, evincing a compassion for the entertainments and the daily events, the annual events of ordinary people in Edo. And then there are the works signed with Hokusai's art names, which we can bring into the realm of works to be reconsidered. Perhaps these might be by Oei, perhaps they might be a joint effort, perhaps there's a collaborative process going on here, an artistic collaboration, any number of possibilities. This particular work is signed using the art name Manji, the swastika symbol we see here that was associated with Buddhism, but many believe to be Oei's. And again, we have that meticulous rendering of light and shade to create the illusion of the sharp contours of the folding fans, as well as technical brilliance in the application of pigments, at which we know Oei excelled. By her father's own admission, we know this too. And perhaps we can theorize and we can detect her hand in some of her father's book illustrations, especially in his later years. The gruesome scene of Guan Yu's fortitude, which we saw just now when he's having his blood let in order to expel the poison, it has overlaps with Hokusai's book of 1843, both in the dynamism of the figures and in the way that the faces are depicted. So I see a striking resemblance here between these two figures, supposedly different historical figures, but an overlap of Chinese warriors, Guan Yu and Shanghai Gung. We have one print where father and daughter came together, a poignant image of an old fisherman resting on a rock with tobacco pouch and pipe in his right hand here. It's inscribed image and inscription by myself, suggesting it may be a self-portrait by Hokusai. And then the poem at above right translates, "This spring we broke a branch from the cassia tree on the moon." And this is signed A, the character for tipsy, which is also found on Oei's paintings. So we know this to be a collaboration with the image and the central poem here by the father, and then the poem here by the daughter. And this expression of breaking off a branch from the cassia tree indicates a great achievement. And it's been suggested the reference here is to completion of those Dutch paintings that we just saw, this being the joint father-daughter commemoration to mark that completion. And we have drawings, I should say, works by the many, many pupils of Hokusai in museums all over the world, including in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And there's an interesting link here between this self-portrait of the fisherman and a drawing in the room of this fisherman holding his net up above him, stooping over as he returns, or perhaps as he heads to the shore. And there's an interesting annotation within the net. seems to say sumikuro, so ink, black, an indication in that process from passing from the artist to the block cutter and then the printer. There's a conversation that has to continue there amongst those collaborators. And two more works from the ROM is attributed to the Hokusai school, and we know nothing more specific about them. The one on the left is perhaps by a pupil a little bit further away from the master, but on the right, we have very much the delicate gradations and sensitivity of Hokusai himself and his best pupils, of a courtesan parading with the lantern stood beside her. And intriguingly, there are two drawings in the ROM on which are written the name Eijo. I'll just show you the details of that there. Most of these drawings are unattributed, so the question is, why would anyone write this name on the drawings? Why would they give these drawings to Oei as artist, unless it was known that the drawings were from her hand? It was extremely difficult for a woman to forge a career as an artist in this period. This was not a possible life choice for many, many women, even if they had trained, even if they had talent. So Oei is certainly unusual. She had the particular position, being Hokusai's daughter. This gave her perhaps the path to forge her own profession, even as we know that was very difficult. The only image we have of her is the sketch on the left by Tsuyuki Kosho, showing her living in cramped conditions with her elderly father in about 1843. But she was not the only such daughter painter. The image on the right by Kawanabe Kyosai from his painting manual cum autobiography, Kyosai Gadan, of 1884, was based on his recollections as his time as a young pupil in the studio of Hokusai's contemporary, Utagawa Kuniyoshi, around 1840. To the left of the master, and I'd also like to point out the cat snuggling within Kuniyoshi's robe and tussling with another one here. But to the left of the master, we have what we believe to be his daughter, Yoshitama Jo. She is given the name here in the annotation above, and this is the young Kyosai himself being taught to paint. And then in a book of reminiscences of the early Meiji era, published later in 1927, Tanaka Tomoenosuke gave a fascinating account of how he had visited Kuniyoshi's eldest daughter, Oyoshi, in Yokohama around 1879 or 1880, Meiji Nisannen Goro. And she was making a living by painting erotic pictures, which she sold to foreigners. So jitsu wa kurashi no tame ni warai ga o kaite seiyojin ni urun desu. So a fascinating glimpse of another artist and how she was managing to forge a living, forge a career. And then on the topic of the corpus, I'd like to add one more work, the possible corpus, one more work, which is signed daughter of Hokusai, Hokusai Musume Tatsujo Hitsu, from the brush of the woman Tatsu, daughter of Hokusai. Now we've heard of Hokusai's two other daughters who were called Tetsu and Mio, who both died young. Tatsu is the East Asian calendrical dragon, which was also within Hokusai's name. And it's been suggested by experts that this work too shows characteristics of Oei's technique. So I wonder, who is Tatsu, the woman Tatsu? This is Hokusai's daughter, so which one should we attribute this beautiful work of a woman with a pot of morning glories to? I'd like to finish by turning to the father once again, as this is the current project that we're working on here in London at the British Museum, as was introduced by Ms. Shimizu. Over the summer, we were able to acquire a group of 103 small brush drawings. They were purchased in Paris in the late 19th century by the jeweler Henri Vavert, and were retained by his family until just after the Second World War. And then they've been in a private collection ever since. They are the final stage block-ready drawings for a book that apparently was never published. And so they were never placed onto that block, never sacrificed in that way, and unusually they survive. Titled The Great Picture Book of Everything, the subjects are suitably diverse, with Buddhist beings, as we see Kannon riding on a dragon at left, mythological themes, wonderful image of the king Ryuri being struck by lightning, trying to fend it off with his arms, but beautiful layering of the different compositional elements here to create a sense of three-dimensionality. And peoples of the world. In the bottom right here, we have an individual from Ezo, which is now known as Hokkaido in the north of Japan, and then a Namban, a southern barbarian, the Portuguese with his large baggy trousers, and then an individual from Vietnam. And there are many other examples of these categories, of these types within the group of 103. We find fascinating connections to Hokusai's work, hinting at his use of a repertoire of models that he could draw on. For example, the Mandarin duck found in this drawing at top left also appears in Hokusai's final publication, the instruction book, The Essence of Colouring, in which he laboured to record everything he knew of drawing and colouring, trying to ensure his artistic legacy was preserved. And then the duck swims into view in this lyrical painting of a river in autumn in the British Museum. Lastly, the cormorant at bottom right of the drawing here reappears as a lonely figure on a tree stump in the painting at left, and is also found in an earlier publication of 1843. These are the connections just with works in the British Museum, so you can imagine how many more there will be to find, and we're expanding our explorations of this. We're planning an exhibition of these drawings and related material for autumn next year, and I sincerely hope by then we will be able to travel and visit each other again. Thank you. Now over to you, Deanna.
Thank you so much, Rosina. That was truly amazing. Now, I have a question for you, and I invite the audience, of course, to ask questions themselves, but I'm going to take my privilege as moderator. Now, you and I just read The Ghost Brush. Having read that book, how did your vision of KATSUSHIKA Oei change, or did it add anything to what you already knew about her?
For me, it made her real, because she'd always been this theoretical figure. And I think Katherine alluded to that in her presentation, that she's been occluded, she's been in the shadows or down the drain, as she put it at the end. And to have her fleshed out, to have it imagined on the page for me, what that relationship was like, was very powerful. And I think we all have particular relationships with our parents, with our mentors, but to be taken through that very emotional experience of Oei's with her father, the tremendous bonds, the push and pull that you feel all the way through, that she wants to be free, but she never wants to leave him. That was very powerful. And I began to try to pin some of this down. I think, like so many others, this process of forgetting that Katherine alluded to is a cumulative process of people not paying enough attention to Oei. And I was re-energized to try to solve some of these problems. There must be elements when we look at the body of material, which is the single sheet prints, but to a larger extent the book illustrations. There are elements that we can use as pieces of evidence to pin down what it was that she did and try to bring her out from that position behind the curtain.
Yes, I think that's so important. And I think, Katherine, your book and the new book that you're writing about, where you're writing about Oei-san. So You did a lot of research. It's a very scholarly book, even in spite of the fact that it's a novel. Tell us about what inspired you to write about her in the first place. And secondly, now that you're doing additional research for your new book, have you discovered something new that you didn't know, or did your view of her change or of her life?
Well, thank you for those questions, and thank you, Rosina, for saying that you've been re-energized to kind of find more. I love that. I'm so thrilled. So that is part of my motivation in a way, and it's generalizable. It's not just Oei, but who I find, as many do, I find her fascinating. That she existed in that time, that she was so different, that she had this enduring relationship with her father, this partnership, which must have been really electric. And so I'm interested in that, but I'm also, as I said, I'm interested in the process whereby a woman in particular can kind of disappear like that and be kind of peeled away. Her work, what is known about her, can kind of dissolve. And as I said, to me, on the second book, the first book, I really felt like I went into her life as others have done, and tried to live it with her, tried to give her a life. I can't believe she was that gloomy and depressive all the time. I think she had a fabulous time on occasion, had lovers, loved her art, was lucky to be able to pursue it, and lost herself in it. But I also think I wanted to know what that process is in general, whereby the inconvenient and the marginalized are stripped of their legacy. And so in the second book, what that takes me to is this, this colonization of Japan by foreigners, the ever so well-meaning fascination they had with the art, but the fact that it was actually removed from its original context, and that which we have known by tradition, and much of this wasn't written down, but there was traditional knowledge. It fell away. So that's what's fascinated me about this. I think I see Oei's face. I see her image in these faces that Rosina pointed out, and many of the animals, and I see it. Somehow it has come alive for me as the art depicts this relationship.
Rosina, what do you think about that?
That process of forgetting is fascinating, and I wonder how much we can attribute to the developments of the late 19th century, of the Meiji era, the full opening of Japan. I wonder how much was already hidden, had already been hidden by the time that began in the 1860s, particularly onwards. I suspect that Oei had to step back herself. I mean, this is part of what we are trying to untangle when she is the ghost brush. She's there, but she's not given acknowledgement because she's a woman, but also because she's Hokusai's child. And I think we could argue that, we could theorize that male pupils would also have had to have stepped back. They might have, if it had been a son, he might also have had to occlude his own name and put his father's, because Hokusai was the one that sold. He was the brand. And we can perhaps think about, it's perhaps useful to think about Hokusai and Oei as a brand. It's a team effort. And like any brand name today, we don't need to know the individual who creates that authentic product. We just need to know that it's authentic. And if it comes from Hokusai's studio, it's authentic. And you can't perhaps ever know any more precisely than that. So I think that process of occlusion had already happened, was already happening as the works were being created. And I was trying to think of other parallel figures, other women, because there have been other women like Yoshitama or Yoshi, Kuniyoshi's daughter. And there were artists, there were female artists in the Meiji era. And I studied, there were other forms of occlusion. I studied a painter of the late 19th century for my doctoral research who had been written out of history for other political reasons. And he had a daughter. And I have met just a member of the family just 2 generations after her. So there's still a memory of this individual. And she couldn't make a living as a female artist. She had to become an art teacher in a school. And she was tremendously talented, but had to relinquish that chance to establish herself as an independent artist. So it carried on for decades after Oei. And it's very worthy what Katherine is trying to do now by excavating this.
Katherine, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I did. It's true that it's a long process, and yes, it must have begun in the earlier days because of so many unsigned works that Oei didn't sign, or seems to have signed with her father or used her father's seal. But there were remnants when the Americans came, and the part of the research that I've been doing now has been through Fenollosa knew about her, Bigelow knew about her. He bought several works by her. Morse, Edward Morse, E.J. Morse, who was there from the very first, said he owned a work by Oei. I don't know where these have gone, but there were, people knew, you know, I think in the art world, in the old art world of Edo, people did know that she was a star. But you're right. I mean, those things disappeared too, but there are these little links one can find, which I found just fascinating.
If I may add then.
Sorry, changes happen through the market, as you say, because certainly money is required and it has to be by Hokusai to sell for that amount. They happen through the collectors, they happen through the dealers, they happen through the curatorial process at museums early on. I mean, there's certainly evidence that Okakura at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston got rid of anything that had to do with the woman. So, you know, there's, as I say, there are many stages. I just have to admire all the women you mentioned and all the women who worked against the odds, you know, to create. What's important about this? Does it matter if it's just we say, oh, we can't say it's Oei, we know they work together, let's just call it Hokusai. Well, it matters for women artists to have a foothold in that legacy. And it matters because Oei's work shows things about women. And if it were, I'm not an expert, I don't speak Japanese, I can't devote more of my life to this, but if someone were to really look at what she is saying about women, there's a real story there, I believe.
It's interesting that collectors such as Morse and Bigelow were picking up examples of her work. It feels like from that alone that they wanted to preserve her reputation. So that was a chance where we could have held on to a knowledge of her, and obviously it's frustrating that we don't know where those works went. I wanted to add that Fenollosa's relationship to Hokusai is a very complex one.
Yes.
What we can attribute of the creation of a Japanese art historical narrative to Fenollosa is very complicated. And that artist that I studied was largely written out of history because of the narratives that Fenollosa and Okakura Tenshin were promulgating, that they had their favored artists, and then there were other artists who were not to be paid attention to because they felt that they were retrogressive and Japanese art needed to move beyond them. And then at a certain point, Fenollosa has a sort of a personal reckoning with Hokusai. He has a reevaluation of him because he realizes that it would be advantageous to his own, Fenellosa's own career, to kind of get with the program that Hokusai is very popular and he needs to pay attention to this figure that he previously had dismissed and denigrated.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And he also needed the money. As I say, Oei had the devil's own luck in terms of preserving her career, because you know, there was the climate of Japan and its attitude toward women artists. There was the colonization, the moving in of the Americans and so on. And even taking up that, and Fenellosa taking a dislike to her father and then going back to him, then Fenellosa got divorced, and so he needed money. So these things were, you know, it was just a constant stream of what shall I say, obstacles for her to history. But I agree with you. I think there are ways. I think there are just ways of looking really carefully. And maybe the first way is to say, it isn't good enough to say it's Hokusai. We know this was a partnership. We know they worked together. We can see that, as you pointed out, the faces on these interesting bits, the birds, the faces that appear in different Chinese warrior scenes. That can all be followed, you know.
I have a question actually from the audience, which I think is very relevant to this discussion. It's thank you so much for your amazing presentations. I wonder if there is still time, whether you could expand a bit on what can be understood by studio. Who was Hokusai working with besides Oei-san, and are there indications on how the production process was divided, like you illustrated with the print production process? And just to add, I mean, Katherine, you talked a lot about this in your book, actually, as to how this worked. And I have one more question that I'm going to give right now as well. And I think this was to Katherine. What is the source of the events and the career of her life that you portray? And did you have any letters or articles or other historical references, or is this something that you, as you described earlier, that you inhabited Oei-san in her life? Okay?
Okay. Rosina, do you want to answer first about the studios, or would you like me to answer?
You can answer first and I'll collect my...
Okay. There are, as I alluded to, bits and pieces of stories about Oei. For instance, the amazing researcher, Kazuhiro Kubota, who I've worked with frequently and visited in Japan, says that this great series, 100 poems written by the nurse, which Hokusai illustrated, was originally commissioned of Oei. And Hokusai took the commission from her, wrote to the publisher and said, no, I will do it myself. So we know that. We know a little bit about Aizen, who has said she did most of the paintings under the name of Ietsu, that were done under the name of Ietsu. That's really important. So we find little bits and pieces. Yes, she worked with Samba Shikitai. Whatever I could find, I tried to inhabit and make a scene. So that's the first answer to the first question. And the studio, as for the studio, I'm sure Rosina knows more about this, but just briefly, yes, there were often apprentices and younger artists working with Hokusai, and they would take part of his art name, Hokumai, for instance. But according to the experts, Hokusai was an A-type individual, and no male artist could work with him. They were not allowed to develop their own style, and they eventually became frustrated and left. Oei could not leave because she was a woman. There was nowhere else to go.
Rosina, did you want to add to that?
The studio refers to, as Catherine's just explained, the master working with various apprentices, pupils, whatever we want to call them, the deshi, as they're known in Japanese. And there's a long apprenticeship in these studios. It was quite codified to a greater or lesser extent, depending on different styles and schools of painting. The official painting school that worked for the ruling regime had very strictly codified structures for how you advanced within the studio. But the artists of the so-called floating world, the popular schools of painting, had similar setups within their painters' atelier. So you would come in at an early age, as we saw that picture of Kyosai, as a boy of 6 or 7 going into Kuniyoshi's studio, and you could stay there for 10, 15 years, and you would progress through different levels of competence. You had to demonstrate your competence in line work initially, and then when you had achieved a certain level there, you were allowed to go on to the application of colors, etc., etc. So you move up grades, and Hokusai himself had done this in Katsukawa Shunsho's studio, and then at a certain point he was able to do book illustrations, and then he was able to strike out on his own with single sheet print designs. You get a character from the teacher's name as a form of graduation or the acknowledgement of affiliation. So you gradually establish yourself. But in terms of, there's never going to be a clear way of describing that division of work as there is with the works produced in multiples, the prints, because I think by necessity that process was designed, or that division of work, excuse me, was designed to be opaque. As I said, this was the Hokusai brand, so if anybody was assisting in that, whether it was unknown disciples or Oei herself, they didn't want the recipient, the customer, the patron to know who had done what. They were just presenting a work from the studio that was authentic and of high quality, and that was enough.
Mm-hmm. Katherine, you raised this in your book. We have a question about Oei's mother. Did she paint, and was her mother encouraging of her painting?
I don't know much at all about Oei's mother, and I'm not sure that others do. She was Hokusai's second wife. There were children by the first wife, and I think there were 2 children by the second wife. The son was Sakijiro, who Oei actually lived with after her father's death for a while, but they thought that she should do housework, and she definitely wasn't going to do that, so she moved out on her own. The mother has, I'm afraid, at this point, vanished into history. However, what I find so exciting about the British Museum's new purchase and all of this is all of these things can be found. Things, you know, records, pictures, whatever, they live in places, they're hidden in boxes, you know, they'll come to light. I hope they'll come to light.
I have another question about poetry. Do we have any examples of poetry that Oei-san wrote that you know of, other than what is on the paintings?
No, I think that's the Surimono. I think her father wrote kind of witty punning verses that were often included in a privately commissioned, beautiful works. Are called Surimono. I don't actually know if there are any attributed to Oei.
I think that Surimono that I showed is very rare because it is actually by Hokusai and the daughter. And
I know, it's amazing. I haven't seen that.
The Surimono were usually commissioned for poetry groups, so they're by the members of those groups. The poems on the prints are by other people. And in the paintings as well, the inscriptions are very often by other people, by writers or poets, and it's a collaborative work between the painters such as Hokusai and then his friend who contributes a poem. And it's less usual it's less typical in this category of painting, the paintings of the floating world, for the artists themselves to contribute poetry. that's something that we get in a very different school of painting called literati painting, where the artist was also a poet, so less so in this field.
So going back to women artists in Japan, we have a question about that. I mean, some of us know of, for example, writers such as Murasaki Shikibu, but who else is there? And is this why Katsushika Oei has become so popular, in the sense that people are looking for women artists? And in your studies, Rosina, apart, you mentioned the daughter of Kuniyoshi, but have you run into anybody else before the 20th century?
Yes, and there was a very important exhibition and catalogue that Catherine mentions in her book as well, called Japanese Women Artists. I believe it's 1700 to 1900 was the span, by Patricia Pfister. And if anyone's interested, I highly recommend that catalogue. It was more common in that school that I just mentioned, the literati school, which had got going in the 18th century and became very widespread. It was taken up across Japan. It was a democratic form of art if you had the right learning. It was based on study of the Chinese classics and drew tremendous inspiration from Chinese painting traditions, but you didn't necessarily have to have a professional training. It was open to you, it was available to you to engage with as an amateur. So this allowed for more women to practice in that field of literati painting, very often more expressionistic, looser ink painting. And there's a difference there. There's a practical day-to-day difference, you could say, between something that is freer, more expressionistic, do it when you feel like it, create these works when you come together with friends, and then the very strict training and that the technical brilliance that I talked about in Oei's works, and of course in Hokusai's works as well. It takes years and years of professional training, and it's harder for a woman to establish herself in that world, as we were saying. So in terms of other artists, there have been a handful through the early modern period. Obviously, ancient authors, authors of the classical period, like Murasaki Shikibu, who was a court lady, they were very exceptional. And even if writings were created, it's again the flukes of history, whether they get transmitted and established as part of the canon.
Catherine, in your book, you have Oei teaching other women. How would these students, what would they have done with this knowledge?
Probably just kept it to themselves within their families. She taught the daughters and wives of merchants, and I believe some of her students became close to her. She would travel to their house to work with them. And this, in her last years, after Hokusai had died, this was one of the things that she did. We have a couple of letters from her that are in her handwriting that she has written from different places. So I think it was more of a, a hobby or something that we know Japanese women love to do, is develop these arts on their own. I don't imagine any of them became professional. Maybe one or two. But I wanted to say about the poetry, I just realized there is one piece of Oei's own handwriting, which is Kazuhiro Kubota has uncovered, and it's in the Hokusai Museum in Obuse, and it is her recipe for the color red. And it's a beautiful little thing about fantastic. You boil something in water and then you bury it under the ground for 6 weeks or 6 months. There's something to do with putting a bullet in it and so on. It has a little picture of her fingers shredding the weed. So that's her poem.
I have a couple of other questions here. So I'm just going to give them all to you so that we can get to them for sure before we have to finish. So can you discuss how Oei signed her work? We talked about that a little bit already, but if you can outline that. Second question, Hokusai sounds like he had a type A personality, which can be difficult to work with. Were there stories of them disagreeing? And how do you think she was able to work with such a difficult personality? And I think in the book, Catherine, you do talk about this quite a bit. And then another question is about shunga, which were the erotic prints. So in the book, Oei is designing shunga. And in the film, Miss Hokusai also has her designing erotica. Do we know of shunga that were known to be by Oei?
Yes, there's quite a lot written about Oei, the daughter who did the shunga. It was a regular source of income for the studio, and sometimes Hokusai would be on the road or involved in something else, and he would assign to Oei these what we would call soft porn pictures. Some of them aren't so soft, but yes, there is one that's arguably signed by her, and of course the very famous Hokusai image is the octopus, and I do think that that's from a woman's point of view. That was one question. What were the others?
Let me just ask Rosina.
Oh, the type A personality.
Yeah.
Rosina, you had a big exhibition about shunga. You probably know more about that than I do.
There is, as you say, some difficult to divide, but some shunga have been tentatively ascribed to her. Ehon Sui no Hinagata is the one in particular. The picture book Models of Couples, it's translated usually. I don't use the term pornography myself, which we discuss in the catalogue, but again, that's another big point of discussion. We call them sex art or erotica as a more familiar term, because they have such a humorous, warm, enjoyable sense to them, and the sentiment behind the shunga design seems to be very much about mutual enjoyment.
Yeah.
And promotion of conjugal harmony. So it's no sense of power imbalance or exploitation that you might associate with pornography. So that's why we use these other terms.
Right.
So it's a very interesting area, and possibly that Ehon Sui no Hinagata, which we have a set of in the British Museum, and you can see that. I would have included one in the presentation, but we're before the watershed, and I thought perhaps we should keep that for a little later in the evening. But I invite you to explore the images there, particularly the mice shunga.
Yeah. Lovely.
I have a related question to that. It says in Western art academias, women were limited because they were not allowed to attend lessons with nude models, among other things. Considering the protagonism of sex in the floating world, was decorum also a limitation for women artists during this period or not?
What a fascinating question. Well, I think it explains, I think that I once talked to an artist here in Toronto who was a huge student of Hokusai. Blair Drawson is his name. And he had looked and looked and looked to find anything that indicated that there was such a thing as a professional art model in Edo. And he claimed that these artists used actually women in their household as models for the lovers in the shunga. I think it's another reason why the brothels were so popular, because you could actually get near and be with a woman and portray her even fully clothed. So yeah, I think in terms of the decorum for someone like Oei, I don't really think so. For the townswomen, for the nobility, probably very much yes. Those women were very protected and closed off. yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'd love to know what Rosina thinks about that.
I think it's asking the wrong question, really, because it's a completely different tradition. And the idea of the nude is just not present within Japanese art before the 1870s. And representations, accurate representations of the body are not felt to be important. So there wasn't the need to master sketching of the nude as there was in the West. So that wasn't a restriction for women artists. Shunga the figures in Shunga are primarily clothed. There's much more charge from glimpses of flesh and as there are in paintings, you often find undergarments, the red robes flying away and a shapely calf, a thigh even being revealed, and particularly glimpses of the genitalia when clothing falls away. So that's the primary focus of the Shunga imagery. And when you look at the representation of the bodies, it's not anatomically correct.
That's true.
Genitalia are definitely, but the legs.
And the legs are coming out in weird directions. And so
yeah, and there's a humorous verse from the early 19th century says something like, "The foolish couple tried to imitate Shunga, sprained an ankle."
Haiku, yes.
A Senryu poem that was just mocking people who were trying to take Shunga literally because it was fantasy. So there's no expectation of needing to sketch bodies in order to produce Shunga.
Interesting.
I want to go back to a question earlier because I don't think we answered it completely. How were the works signed? I know that there were different names used, and Katherine, you also talk about this in your book. Could you just go over, when we're looking for her work, all the different signatures that could possibly, or stamps that could possibly indicate that it was done by KATSUSHIKA Oei?
Oh, that's a huge question. I would refer to an expert on that. I have a photograph of the signature on Guanyan's arm, which has been vindicated. We know that that's Oei, and I have always looked at that and thought, well, I don't see that, so she hasn't signed or it's not her. But you know, there are a number of them and a number of seals. I defer to you, Rosina.
Names are slippery within Japanese art. I think that's the first thing to say, because people can take and did take different names at different times. Artists took different names at different times. And she uses, as her father did, she uses a variety of names, sometimes playfully. And Oei is not one that you will ever find on her works, because that's just an affectionate way of addressing her. And Katherine talks about the kind of familial joking that's going on with that one. She calls herself A-jo, which means the woman A. And she sometimes uses that character for Tipsy that I showed in the Surimono, which is a homonym. It's also pronounced A. And then I speculated that Tatsu could be another name that she appropriates for herself, and it's an element of one of her father's names. I'm probably missing out some here as I'm thinking through it, but artists had different names at different points in their career, and then different names for different situations. And seals were another whole area. Cutting an ivory seal, usually made of ivory, could be, the characters that you chose could be an expression of personality, mood, could be a little poem. And yes, seals were passed from master to pupil sometimes, and were treasured for that reason, because they were proof of the authentic brand that I talked about earlier, and could be used dishonestly in that way as well, that a painting by a follower, by a pupil, could be presented as authentic because the seal is authentic. So it's complex.
Yeah, I think that just by that Tatsu painting, I now believe is attributed to Oei. I looked on the LACMA website, but you know, I don't know any other where it's literally been changed that clearly. In terms of the names, you know, artists even sold their names. I don't think Oei ever did, but Hokusai would sell his name. He'd establish a name, get to a certain point, and want to change his style, and the publishers would say, no, you can't do that. Well, I'll sell it and start out with another name. This was part of your capital as an artist, was the name that you had created for yourself, and then you got to sell it and move on. So
no, I think that's actually, sorry, Rosina, go ahead.
Just a quick point that we should explain. Many viewers will be familiar with this, but this is not unique to the art world, that these kabuki actors that Hokusai was portraying, particularly in the early stages of his career, also had this kind of sloughing off one skin, that you can progress to another name as you move through your career. And they were awarded them officially within the system of theatres. So other members of the world of the arts were doing this as well, using different names at different times.
Yes, and when you change your name, you change your destiny. So
You start again,
I think on that note, there's so many mysteries about Katsushika Oei. And Catherine, when is your book coming out?
I don't know. We're kind of COVID delayed, but I think it will be within 2020, end of 2021 to 2022.
Well, I, for one, am very much looking forward to seeing that. And on that note, I would like to thank you both. I have learned so much from this conversation, and I hope everyone who is watching has learned as well. And thank you again. This will go up on YouTube. So if you enjoyed it and want to refer it to others, please go ahead and do so. And a final thank you to the Japan Foundation and to the Japan Society. And domo arigatou gozaimashita. It was great to see you all.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, wonderful to meet you both. Thank you.